I didn't record. Okay, we'll start again. Okay. So we have to do it on record. Hi, my name is Dr. Leon Lefkowitz. Professor Daphne Tzur from Stanford will be the boss of this first panel. Our next workshop or our main workshop will be on Sunday the 13th. It will start at 9:30 until 4 o'clock. We chose only Israelis to participate in this panel. So it will be a true Israeli workshop. Maybe next year we'll expand it to include other foreigners in our workshop. It is recorded, and I would like to thank the Korean Embassy for its generous support, supporting us for 5 years. It's a wonderful opportunity. We see the Korean Studies Workshop as a Korean family, that we can meet together, have a nice atmosphere, complain, and have a wonderful academic criticism in a very polite way. So the floor is yours. Daphne, you're the boss. Toda.
Okay, wonderful. It's funny to hear Alon speak about a conference with only Israeli participants. Back some years ago, that would have meant 3 people. It's just amazing to see how much Korean studies has grown in Israel, and how many students are interested in moving beyond the undergrad, learning Korean, and then doing a master's and a PhD, both in Israel and abroad. So this is really exciting to see this wonderful growth, and it's thanks to tireless work on the behalf of Korean Studies faculty in Israel and the Korean Embassy that has been so supportive. So just so excited to be part of this. And I really hope to be able to visit soon. Many of you know my parents live in Jerusalem, and I haven't been in person since May of 2019, which is when I was invited to a conference there. So I'm really hoping to visit as soon as the vaccine is given to us. I will be jabbed and I'll be ready to go. So, all right. So without further ado, I'd like to move into the interesting whole part of this panel, which is these 2 fascinating papers. So we will hear today from Anat Schwartz, who is a PhD student at the University of California, Irvine. And Avia Amir, who's a PhD student at the University of California, Riverside. So we are all neighbors, but we are now on a stay-at-home order, meaning that we're not allowed to travel outside of our county at the moment. So we will have to just stay with Zoom for the time being. So my understanding is that each presenter will be speaking for about 20 minutes. After which, so I think we'll start with Anat and then we'll go to Avia. And I will make a couple of comments based on the papers, and then we'll open the floor to broader discussion. So take it away, Anat.
Awesome. Thank you, Alon and Daphne, for facilitating today. And of course, thank you to the Korean Embassy for making this possible. So as Daphne mentioned, my name is Anat Schwartz, and I am currently, hopefully, wrapping up my PhD at the Department of East Asian Studies at the University of California, Irvine. My dissertation project is on contemporary feminist activism and communities, and I trace Korean feminist history, focusing on the post-authoritarianist period. And I kind of recently conducted my fieldwork. I finished in 2019, right before COVID kind of exploded, I guess. So I was very fortunate to come back right before things got a little hectic. So I will start us off. Could we enable screen sharing by any chance? I think my talking is a lot more boring if I don't have visual aids. Okay, awesome. Thank you. All right. Sorry. Hopefully you can all see along with me. So today I will be discussing what was a growing concern when I was doing my fieldwork in 2018 and 2019, which is the growth of trans exclusionary radical feminist rhetoric and ideology in South Korea. So this is just a portion of an argument that I make in one of my dissertation chapters. And I really wanted to share this with everyone today because it's something that I'm still working through. I'm not sure I'll be able to get through all of my slides within the 20-minute period. I tried, but we'll see. So if anyone wants to see my slides or has more questions, definitely during the Q&A section, or feel free to email me and I will send those over anytime. So today I am going to, like I mentioned, focus on traditional ideas of trans exclusionary radical feminism, which I'm going to call TERF from here on, just for the sake of ease. And I will expand on TERFs in a bit, but I want to begin us with my argument, which is that TERF ideology in radical Korean feminist spaces differs from Western TERF ideologies, and that the particularities of the heteropatriarchal conservative Korean state and the continued violence against young women puts young female feminists at this very interesting intersection where the exclusion of non-binary and trans women is framed by radical feminists as a method of keeping their activist spaces safe from biological men who are viewed as a physical threat to them. And so in my essay, I turned to recent popular feminist movements, particularly Break the Corset, Me Too, and the Uncomfortable Courage, the protest against illegal photography, to argue that the growth of TERF ideology and transphobia in recent years is exacerbated by misogyny and femicide. In other words, the exclusion of trans women and gender nonconforming people from feminist spaces is a direct response to misogyny and anti-women rhetoric. So I quickly will try to define Korean feminism, radical feminism, and what is TERF ideology. And then I use a feminist ethnographic method to argue that the focus on biological essentialism is a byproduct of recent wide-scale movements against sexual violence and is a growing division among feminists, both queer and cisgender. So I know I'm using a little bit of jargon, but as we will see in this presentation, it's a little bit more a gender and sexuality studies, cultural studies lens than it is a traditional Korean studies theoretical intervention. So this is just, as I mentioned, a part of a larger project. This is part of, I think it's going to be my 4th chapter. I'm still working on its location in the dissertation. So it kind of follows a lot of other tracing of feminist movements in Korea. All right, so a little bit about my methods before I jump right in. As I mentioned, this was my field work. I had 50 in-depth interviews with self-identified feminist activists, and the majority were women on the younger end, so in their 20s and 30s. And my main kind of questions in my dissertation follow along how do feminist activists define feminism in contemporary South Korean context, and how does social media affect those spaces. So the growth of TERF, of trans exclusionary ideology, is definitely a very interesting and complicated space, but also something that is very tied to my larger project. Oops. So feminisms, right? It's kind of hard to condense a definition of feminism. I hope most of us have a general idea that feminism is the fight or the movement to gain equal rights and equal status for all people, regardless of gender, race, identity, gender expression, sexuality, et cetera, But in Korea, there is quite a bit of back and forth on what is a feminist movement and what that feminist movement should look like. And I'll show you that in a second. But I think it's really important to remember that feminism is something that is based on Carol Hanish's idea of the personal is political. It is always going to be personal. There is no feminist movement without the personal aspect, and nor does it exist without the political aspect as well. So this doesn't mean that the personal is a unifying our singular experience, and neither is this political aspect. So there's no singular feminism. Feminism, as I mentioned, encompasses a diverse, I guess, arena of activism in different places, spaces, and time, etc. So I don't want to go too deep into feminist waves. This is just kind of what I have gathered from my research, from my interviews, from reading a lot of different Korean feminist scholarship, where the definition of these waves kind of falls into these four traditionally known feminist waves, but this is sort of how Korean feminists themselves locate these timelines. So just for the sake of brevity, we'll just quickly go through it really quickly. But the first wave is kind of placed during Japanese colonial rule. The second wave, which is continued in many ways, was the focus on anti-sexual violence during the post-liberation and authoritarian period. And then we see different forms of feminism. I don't want to go into Minjung feminism too much, but that's just feminism that was, I guess you could call it a nationalist feminism in many ways, because it was aligned with the Minjung movement, which was the common or everyday people's movement by ordinary people, intellectuals, religious leaders, students, laborers, newly emerged middle class, etc., to redefine a democratic nation in Korea. And so feminists aligned themselves with this national project in order to gain kind of success, but also to align themselves with an emerging new, I guess, era of democracy. And so we can see also that same thing continue in the labor and student movements. And then third wave is 1990s. We have what was called young feminists, which were young, then women in their 20s and 30s, who were redefining what anti-sexual violence activism looks like. And then today we have our current period, which is the so-called fourth wave, which we see a very clear diversification of activism. So we'll talk about that in a second, but that kind of looks very, very fractured. You have the continuation of anti-sexual violence work. You see that very clearly, but then you also see different ways of doing activism, just because the fact that we have different technological advancements, we have social media, we have now the ability to be online and offline at the same time, and also the landscape of South Korea, socially, politically, is more conducive to fracturing of feminist movement. So I will continue a second, but we talked a little bit about national feminism and what that kind of looks like. In many ways, we can see continuous issues with a national feminist identity, kind of these problems with it continue, because clearly the national feminist idea is not really fully actualized in South Korea. We see that through the Me Too movement that tried to find a way to strengthen a legislative push for an anti-sexual violence bill, which still has not passed as far as I'm aware. The idea of transnational feminism is sort of a response to the idea that there is a global or international feminism, but that idea of a global or international feminism is very Eurocentric, very colonialist. And so transnationalism as a term problematizes these locational politics. So when I talk about a transnational TERF movement, what I'm talking about is sort of the transnational circulation of transphobic ideology. The common ideological reasoning being that biology is fixed and binary, and that women are born and socialized as women, and men are born and socialized as men. So when we think of TERF ideology, or also known as gender critical theory, it kind of sounds like a conservative gender ideology soundbite, like J.K. Rowling, right, of Harry Potter and TERF fame, right? And then we have transnational TERF movement that sort of try to constrain people and also activists to a gender binaryism. So it really does sound quite a bit like a conservative think piece, but that's kind of where they're at, I suppose. So there are two, this is very confusing, at least it was for me, that there is radical feminism and then there is radical feminism. So radical feminism can look in different ways. It can mean taking radical strategies to doing activism. For instance, one group that I worked with while I was in Korea, they wanted to continue the push to repeal the ban on to repeal the criminalization of abortion in Korea. So they decided to get the abortion pill, put it into a vending machine, and have people take that pill in real time, not being able to tell which pill was real and which one was placebo. And they had everyone sign waivers and had everyone, the people who were going to take the actual pill, sign a waiver saying that they knew they were going to take the real pill. But for press concerns, for the people who were just standing by and watching, you couldn't tell who was taking the actual birth control, the actual abortion pill, and who was taking a placebo pill, just to show that the pill had no serious side effects, that it could be taken as easily like that, and that it's not as scary as the anti-abortionist activists and thinkheads were saying it was. And so that is a radical feminist activism. That is part of radical feminist activism. That is a radical move to try and show that there is a need for abortion provisions, for abortion methods to be more easily accessible in Korea. And so that's one form of radical feminist activism. And then we have radical feminism that is exclusionary of trans people, that is exclusionary of non-binary people. And so those are two separate ways of radicalism. And so I kind of talked already about TERFs a little bit, but the central argument for trans exclusionary radical feminism is that binary essentialism. The all women have a uterus, all women go through a period. That is what defines a woman, which also, of course, excludes women who do not have, a uterus, do not have their periods now or anymore. And so it's kind of denied that self-autonomy. So in my paper, I talk quite a bit about a divergence of these feminist paths. And I trace that to Me Too movement because that is was one of the biggest movements in Korea for feminist activism in 2018 and 2019. It reached quite a height in the beginning of 2019. And then I move into talking about uncomfortable courage, which is also known as the Haewa subway station protests. And those are two very, very, very different feminist spaces. So I worked with an organization that frequently spearheaded the Me Too movement protest in Korea. But at the same time, they did not participate in the uncomfortable courage protests. And those who participated in uncomfortable courage protests did not show up at the Me Too movement protest. Even though Me Too movement, the protest spaces were open to everyone, there was no sort of limitations on it, but they were seen as two separate, very, very separate spaces that wouldn't really intersect in any way. And some of the members of the organization I worked with who were behind a lot of the Me Too protests didn't feel comfortable or welcomed or wanted to associate with the uncomfortable courage protests, which we'll see why in a second. So the uncomfortable courage protests were focused on the rampant issue of spy cams, also known as 몰카, in private and public spaces. I'm hoping most of you have heard a little bit about this, but that is those tiny little spy cameras in bathrooms and hotel rooms. And so this was the movement to continue the investigations against those who are installing and circulating videos from those cameras, but also to deal with what activists perceived as biased investigations by the police and the presumption that men are innocent when they are found with those cameras. But the uncomfortable courage protests were certainly the biggest turnout for a feminist protest in recent memory. I believe, I wrote down the fourth rally drew in 70,000 activists that they were bussed in throughout Korea. So that was quite a big turnout, and it did bring quite a bit of attention on a national scale. So just a quick example. So we can see, I know it's really small, the writing, I couldn't get any bigger, but we can see like from the most left poster and then the second from the right, the most left poster was a poster from the Black Wave, which is or was a protest series to repeal the criminalization of abortion. And then the one in red is a protest poster from the Uncomfortable Courage protest that I just mentioned. Both of them say on them, like the one on the far left says, 오직 여성만. So only women, only biological women can enter. And the one in red says pretty much the same thing. Oh, the writing is really small, but it says, I think it says, 생물학적인, yeah, only biological women can enter. So, cyber pornography, cyber crimes are definitely an important role in the push for more radical responses to perceived gender-based hate crimes and violence against women. But also anonymity is a big part of this. As I mentioned, like there is this part of the online and offline intersecting and complicating activism, but also anonymity is really important for organizing in these radical spaces. So a big difference between Me Too, the Uncomfortable Courage protest is Me Too movement is organized by civic women's organizations, women's centers, outspoken, feminist public figures, and so forth. And the Uncomfortable Courage protests were organized by anonymous groups of women, primarily those who are active in radical feminist spaces online, like WOMAD or Megalia, or not Megalia, not anymore, but WOMAD. Yeah. So this focus on biological female only spaces is very complicated. How do we define who is a woman? Who and how is that, by who and how is that decided? So in Ewha Women's University at one protest, women were activists entering or attendees entering were asked to show their national ID, which has the number, right? You're either a 1 or a 2. If you're a 1, you're biologically male. If you're a 2, you are biologically female. And so you were asked to show your ID. And that either excluded a lot of people who didn't want to show up because they're trans or non-binary, but it also excluded allies or people who just thought that that was very wrong. And so in large scale events like Uncomfortable Courage, they couldn't really ask to see IDs just because of the volume of the space. So instead, people were excluded based on the look, like whether or not you looked female or not. But who says that? How do you guess who looks or doesn't look female, right? But in my interviews, I included quite a bit of my interviews in the paper itself, and I wish I could have time to include it here, but my interviewees argued that the space for feminist organizing is already very limited and dangerous to organize itself just by the complicated nature of organizing. And so trans people, non-binary people, their issues are seen as different and therefore should be separate. So that is the argument. I mean, it's definitely a transphobic argument, but it is also a little bit different than the argument that you see elsewhere, meaning outside of Korea. So I want to make sure I wrap up. But
yeah, it's 2.5 minutes. Yep.
Oh, okay, 2.5 minute warning. Yeah, it's hard to see the chat while you're presenting, but yeah, I have my timer just in case. Yeah. So another part of this complicated movement to see who is or who isn't female based on just viewing them is definitely the Break the Corset movement. I think some of you might have heard that, but this was a movement to reject traditional images of femininity, meaning high heels, makeup, feminine clothing, or mannerisms. This was quite a big push in 2018. It reached quite a lot of international headlines, but obviously breaking the so-called corset excludes a lot of people, not just sexual minorities and the LGBTQIA communities, but also women in precarious position, women who need to look a certain way for their jobs, etc. So it created in a new way, it created a new aesthetic and gender performativity for young feminists. So in what I call a new form of corset that is chosen by radical feminists themselves. So rather than a complete rejection of femininity, it created an alternative version of femininity. I don't want to go into cybercrimes too much, but there is a clear threat that why anonymity continues to be an important method of organizing for young South Korean feminists today is certainly the continuous threat of cybercrimes. So if you have questions about that, we'll get to that maybe in the Q&A. So in conclusion, the growth of transphobia and the exclusion of non-conforming people from activist spaces is not necessarily due to that TERF ideology I mentioned in the beginning. It's not necessarily due to the gender binaryism that is enforced within TERF ideology. Rather, non-conforming bodies are excluded as a solution to the threat of anti-women violence. Like, this is definitely a transphobic argument. I'm not saying otherwise, but this is the way that it's framed is quite different. In my paper, I mentioned Cass Weston's argument about the unsexed moment, where there's that one moment when you enter a bathroom where you are under suspicion whether or not you're really a woman, whether or not you belong in that space. And that same thing happens in these protest spaces. You enter and you're under observation, you're under surveillance for a split second, whether or not you belong or don't belong in that space. And that moment never lasts. That moment of quandary, of wondering whether or not you're a woman never lasts. A decision is made at the end. And that is included or extended to these feminist spaces. So the transphobic exclusion and focus on labeling on who is or isn't biologically female, I argue, is embedded within the contemporary movement against sexual violence. So I will end here. I know that was a lot in a short amount of time, but yeah, thank you all for listening.
Great, thank you, Anat, and for being so punctual with time. Okay, we'll move on to Avia, and I will start my timer, and yeah, take it away, Avia. Via, I think you're
still... unmute yourself.
Okay. So thank you all also. I'm very excited to be able to participate in this transatlantic event, even though I am in fact in Israel. So it's quite entertaining. Also, so my paper has no connection to what you all just heard. Thematically speaking, it is on a completely different topic and also in a different discipline. So I am at the Department of Comparative Literature at UC Riverside. So that's my angle. And I am also, like Anat, I'm also nearing the end, heading towards the end of my dissertation. So it's all fighting. And my topic is on militarism and portrayals of soldiers in contemporary Korean, Japanese, and Israeli fiction. So it covers specifically the era of 2000s and later, and I'm looking at big shifts that happen. So my concern is militarism. Now, what I'm going to present here is a paper that is tangentially related to my research in that it deals with militarism, so it's thematically connected. But one of the films I'm working with is Seven Samurai by Akira Kurosawa, which is from the 50s, so very much out of my timeline. So it doesn't fit into my dissertation itself, but it is connected, as you'll see, thematically to some of the ideas that I end up dealing with. Now, if you are, I don't know if you're so familiar with presentations from the literatures or complete, there's a tendency to read the paper rather than present. I have knuckled under to this tendency, so I'm going to also read my paper. Hopefully I'll do it in an interesting way. We just have a tendency towards long sentences. But if we'll have a minute at the end, I will show a picture or two. So, A small, isolated rural village is under the threat of annihilation by a force with superior military power. 7 warriors, each with a different backstory, gather to protect the village in what they know might be a suicide mission. Though they are successful, in the end, only 2 of them walk away from the field of battle. This is the plot of Akira Kurosawa's 1954 film, 7 Samurai, and the finale of Park Kwang-hyun's 2005 film, Welcome to Dongmakgol. The juxtaposition of these films raises questions about the ways that the narratives around civilian and military societies are constructed, and the tension in them is heightened by the presence of apparatuses, modernity and nationalism. And I'm here referencing Agamben's apparatus. Now, this paper additionally reads these films alongside Judith Butler's Precarious Life in order to consider the approach to mourning presented by each film, and these approaches are linked to images of modern warfare and the construction of the nation state. So 7 Samurai is set in the 16th century. It is about a village that is beset by bandits. They threaten to return and steal the harvest at the end of the summer. The villages gather rice and set off to hire samurai willing to fight to protect their village. 7 Ronin gather together with the villagers. They successfully fight off the bandits, though 4 of them and several villagers are killed in the process. At the end, the leader of the samurai, Kanbei, together with his friend Shichiroji, are the only 2 to leave the village. The 3rd samurai remaining alive, the young Katsushiro, is implied to leave as well, but the film ends with him torn, watching the young village woman he fell in love with working in the fields with the other villagers. So there's an element of kind of, did he leave, did he not leave? Or you might say emotionally, he does not leave. Obviously, this film is very critically acclaimed. There has been widespread academic treatment, and it is very well known. But I have not found any treatment of Welcome to Dongmakgol as being connected thematically to 7 Samurai yet. There has not been nearly as much research on Welcome to Dongmakgol. Most of it is in the Korean language and deals and focuses on Welcome to Dongmakgol as an example of Bundan film, of separation film. And it deals with issues of memory and other, which are very significant in this film. So Welcome to Dongmakgol is set in a small village named Dongmakgol during the Korean War, which is so isolated that the villagers are unaware that there is a war going on or even what guns and grenades are. Several soldiers from both sides come upon the village, one of whom is an American soldier named Smith, who was wounded when his plane crashes outside the village, and he's treated by the villagers. There are 2 South Korean soldiers, the older of whom deserted as a result of a horrific order that he was forced to carry out, and 3 North Korean soldiers who are the only survivors of their platoon. They accidentally destroy the storehouse of food for the winter, and all remain to help with the harvest in exchange. When they realize that the United Forces have called down an airstrike on the village in the mistaken belief that there is a communist anti-aircraft base there, they band together in order to save the village in what they know will be a suicide mission. At the last minute, Smith and a Korean from the Allied Army, who also join them, head back to the main army to inform them that there is no threat from the village. The rest of the soldiers successfully divert the attention of the airstrike, take down several airplanes, and are killed in the bombing, but succeed in saving the village. Now, the portrayal of the village in 7 Samurai aims for historical verisimilitude, and it avoids some of the idealized simplicity that other Chambara Jidaigeki films that tend to romanticize rural village life of pre-modern Japan. Kurosawa portrays the villagers as poor peasants. They're downtrodden, they struggle against starvation. And Martinez explains that the layers in the relationship between the villagers and the samurai, that there is a complex portrayal of social class here, but also a complicity of the oppressed in their own oppression, because the villagers had unsuccessfully tried to buy off the bandits by giving them the beautiful wife of one of the village men, but they're now left helpless and emasculated and sort of emotionally unable to resist because of the lingering guilt. So this is an historical discrepancy because, historically speaking, they probably would have had experience fighting, at least some of them, in wars, and would have presumably been able to actually muster some kind of defense for their village. Now, but it's also possible, I view this relationship also as a type of relationship between civilians and professional soldiers, because there's a very clear class distinction between the villagers and the samurai, even among the quality of rice that the villagers provide to the samurai, and they have to eat poorer food. So I posit that it's not just their guilt that they are unable to defend themselves because of, but because of their position as peasants within the class apparatus. They can learn how to fight, but they don't have the ability to lead or plan combat without the help of the samurai. And when the samurai leave the village at the end, the villagers return to their agrarian lives and completely shaking off their moment as warriors. So the fundamental class relations between the samurai and the villagers remain unchanged. So in contrast, Dormakol is a nostalgic fantasy location, which is outside the boundaries of the real world and its apparatuses of power. The town of Dormakol is separated from the rest of the world by surreal butterflies who signal the entrance into an unreal space where regular logic is suspended. These butterflies have been posited as a sort of spirit of Dormakol and the protectors and incarnation of its fallen. This separation also sets Dormakol aside as a location that is beset by external brutality rather than internal. So by this separation, the Korean War itself is rendered almost as a fantasy, and this semi-allegorical nature breaks it down into a slightly more digestible form. So like several other Korean films like Daekuki, it focuses more on pure human emotion and avoids ideological confrontation. So, and it has been analyzed as kind of an extension of the other Bundan films in the fact that it adds this kind of surrealistic element to it. Now, towards the end of the harvest, Suwa, who is the commander of the North Korean force, asks the village headman how he is able to control his people without raising his voice. The headman replies that he does not control the people, he simply provides them with food. Through this, the film insists that Dormakol does not in fact have any actual power structure at all, neither modern nor traditional. But from the moment the soldiers have entered, it becomes a location that is in jeopardy of violence. Now, the physical relation of each village to the battle is very different. In Seven Samurai, the village itself is under attack and the village itself must be defended. And the village itself becomes the battlefield and the location of deaths. The people who die, die within the village. But at the end, all the people return to their daily lives and they are able to continue living their normal lives safely. In contrast, even though the threat to Dormakol may seem greater because an airstrike would wipe out everything completely, the battle itself happens outside of the village. So the core of the homeland, if it is taken, then there is nothing left to return to. And as a result, when the battle is successfully won, the village retains no traces of the battle itself, only some of the violence. So because, in a sense, paradoxically, because the battle itself happened out of sight and there was no ability to deal with emotionally and mourn the violence that had happened, they are unable to completely dislodge it. And this will be talked about more later. Now, so who are the defenders? In Seven Samurai, the villagers set out to gather the samurai to defend them. The hired samurai gather outside the village, they pledge their service, but they enter it already as one unit, as a group. They negotiate their own unification among each other, and they are disconnected from the villagers. Now, there are two characters who, to some extent, cross class lines. The first being Kikuchiyo, who is discovered to have been a peasant, but he is accepted in the end as a samurai. And the other one is the young samurai Katsushiro, who develops a romance with a village woman, and there is an implication that he would like to stay in the village. But in both of these cases, the class transition is intentional. It is not something that happens by accident. And it also does not actually break down the fundamental structures that they're dealing with. Now, in contrast, the relationship between the soldiers and civilians in Dormakol is more complicated and less stratified. The soldiers enter the village in separate groups, and each group is a small part separated from their greater whole, which is a nation state in some form. So they are torn out of their own modern apparatus and taken into the village. And their stalemate, there's a stalemate between the North and South Korean soldiers who are holding guns to each other, and it's broken by the ignorance of the villagers who don't understand that a threat is even happening and go about their days. So these divided loyalties and the apparatus that they bring is in fact broken down. It doesn't have power within this area. And this begins the process of integrating the soldiers into village life. So they agree on a truce to help the villagers bring in the harvest. And there are two key events that shape the soldiers from outsiders to members of the village itself. The first is hunting a boar, which plagued the village. The villagers are completely paralyzed in the face of this violence, and it is only the soldiers who work together in order to be able to defeat it. So the villagers prevail because of their ability to co-opt an external force, which is the soldiers, to fight their battle for them. Unlike the samurai who bonded with each other and then came to the village, the Dongmakol soldiers are united by the necessity of protecting the village itself. They are united within the village and affected by it. They share the boar meat afterwards, and they do it in a sense as warriors sharing their kill rather than soldiers of separate modern forces. The second key element of integration is clothing. While their uniforms are being laundered, the soldiers are all provided with local garments instead, which includes the American soldier, who is also given the appropriate dress, but it doesn't fit him properly. So he still stands out as being other, but he is also accepted clearly as becoming one of them. But later on, he is provided with a chogori that is big enough to actually fit him, and this change in status is solidified by his next action, which is to assist the village matriarch and carries her on his back in a show of filial piety. So when the Allied forces enter the village and demand that the North Korean soldiers be turned over to them, at that point, the villagers protect the soldiers by pretending that they are family. They say that there are no soldiers, and different villagers claim that one of the soldiers is part of their family. So they've now been integrated by familial bonds into the village, and the Allied soldiers, they beat the village headman very severely. And now the soldiers who have become truly the soldiers of Dongmakol, they fight back against the soldiers, they kill all of them. And this includes Smith, the American soldier, who hits one of the other soldiers over the head with a rock. So, this is their first action as soldiers of Dongmakol rather than their respective armies. So they understand that they need to go to battle once more, but when they put on their old uniforms, it is clear this time that it doesn't matter what visual the uniform represents. They are now wearing these as uniforms of Dongmakol rather than their own individual uniforms. And even the American has been subverted. Now, they go and they shoot down Allied planes and they are killing Allied soldiers, and there is no concern about this. So at this point, Dongmakol is a nation which now sends her own sons to do battle and sacrifice their lives on her behalf. Now, both of these movies end with a shot of the graves of the fallen soldiers. Now, these shots are very different. And I will briefly show at the end. I'll take a second and show you those shots. But in both cases, the graves are marked by their weapons. In Seven Samurai, you can see a hill which has the graves of the villagers, and on top there are several mounds with the soldiers' katana sticking out of them. In Welcome to Dongmakol, you see the day after the battle, the camera pans over the battlefield, and their weapons are left poking out of the snow, which has covered it. So they are buried, and the weapons signify where their graves lie. But in the case of Seven Samurai, the graves are located within the village. They are right next to the village. The graves of the villagers and the soldiers are next to each other, and they are clearly visible from where the village people are working, meaning it has become part of the fabric. The death has become part of the life of the village, part of the natural cycle of the village. However, in the case of Welcome to Dongmakol, there's a very big dissonance because the soldiers who die, the scene shows them almost being joyfully immolated by a rain of bombs. The bombs are falling and it's glowing and it looks almost beautiful. And we see the villagers of Dongmakol looking up at and cheering at the sky as if they're watching fireworks. So and their expressions are invisible. So the camera, when it shows it, you can see where they died, but they have not been buried. There is no ceremony or any change that causes it. And the graveyard itself is invisible from the village, and the villagers did not die. Now, this is also relevant because the soldiers were sent to defend the borders. So the country is safe. So it is a victory. But the marks of battle are distant from the core. Now, Judith Butler, in Precarious Life, devotes an essay to the question of mourning, where she juxtaposes the I and the other, specifically in the relationship to mourning, and she argues that mourning has to do with agreeing to undergo a transformation or submitting to a transformation that you cannot know the full result of in advance. And this transformation inextricably links the I and the other. To mourn is to acknowledge that connection, and that by that loss of the other, the I loses part of itself. Now, in this sense, she says that on a political level, grief itself is something to be feared and must be banished by action, because the state cannot exist in continued vulnerability. So in this case, where we see these portrayals of the self and the other, in Seven Samurai, there is, in fact, successful mourning. The village might continue unchanged, but the graves show that there were burial rituals. There is the implication of burial rituals, and there is, in fact, a burial scene earlier in the film. Whereas, so in this case, the villagers have consented to be transformed in order to include these deaths in their daily lives. Whereas in Welcome to Donmakol, there is a zoom out from above, and it gives the graves no context within the frame. There is a white space with the graves in the middle, and you cannot, with the weapons signifying the graves, and there's no real world context as to where this is or how it connects to the rest of the world. And it speaks only to the viewers, in a sense, that the viewers are the ones who are capable of mourning these deaths. And the final scene is a flashback of the 5 Korean soldiers sleeping. And this, in a sense, it links their deaths with a nostalgic image of a time before the transformation, of a nostalgic time, and it minimizes the meaning of their death by conflating it with peaceful sleep. So it pulls away from the reality of death and the pain of mourning, and allows neither the audience nor the characters of the film to truly grieve, because the grief would undermine the national narrative. The only character who is able to grieve, who grieves towards the camera, is Smith, who cries as he walks away, because he would have preferred to stay and die, but he cannot. Now, this in a sense is complicated because it is his fault that the village was destroyed, because him landing there was actually what set in motion this entire sense of destruction. Now, Renato Rosaldo has a term, imperialist nostalgia, where people mourn the passing of what they themselves have transformed. So this, in a sense, reflects the American presence in Korea, the transformation that has happened as a result of imperialism, and that it is only Smith who is able to, ironically, imperialistically mourn what he has destroyed. And it could also perhaps link to Bruce Cummings, who argues that the Americans who participated in the Korean War never quite even understood what they were doing or who the Korean people were. So
yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. You do need to wrap up though, please. Thank you.
Yes, this is my last sentence. So perhaps we could say that it is a plea that if the Americans must bring destruction up in their wake, at least let them feel sorry about it. So I am going to very briefly share a screen. This is the shot of the graves in Seven Samurai. As you can see, there are the graves at the top overlooking the village, and the lower squat ones are the graves of the villagers. And then this is the shot of the graves in Welcome to Donmakol. You see the camera pans out, and it is almost hard to tell that there are graves. They're swallowed up by the shot, and then it pans to the soldiers who are sleeping peacefully. Thank you. I will stop.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm just taking furious notes. All right, thank you to both of our participants for really fascinating, 2 very fascinating papers. What I'd like to do is to give you each some questions to think about. So things that I kind of put together reading your papers, and then you can either respond to my questions, or we can take questions from participants, and then and respond in that way. So I'm going to start just by order of presentation. I'm going to start with Anat. So with Anat, I'll go on to Avia, and then I want to just say a couple of things in general that I think are true of both papers. So with Anat, I have a bunch of questions about your work. First, you mentioned that feminists in Korea have translated and appropriated feminist scholarship in a way that suits the South Korean context. I'd love to hear some examples of that. How have Korean feminists translated creatively South Korean texts from non-Korean context? So what are some specific examples, either documents or discursive practices that you can mention? So that's the first question. The second question is, the exclusion of trans women from the feminist table is by no means unique to South Korea, as I'm sure you know. So it's not really entirely clear to me. You mentioned it here and there, but I would really like to understand what are the specifically South Korean aspects of the exclusion of trans women. How do you make sense of the feminist push, the South Korean feminist push, on the one hand, to reject traditional femininity, but at the same time to reject non-conforming participants? So how do you make sense of those competing impulses? Third is actually more specific to something that came up in your paper. You describe this very real concern about these protesters, groups being infiltrated by men disguised as women out there to take their pictures. But that's not what trans women are, right? Trans women are not men disguised as women. They are women. So it seems that there's quite a lot of ignorance about trans issues among Korean feminists. So I'm kind of really interested in why, what exactly South Korean feminists understand as the issues that trans women have. Did you interview any people from the trans community in Korea to understand the issues from their end? So that's the third question. And two more. The fourth is, how does the feminist movement in South Korea relate in either form or content with other social movements in South Korea? Who do feminists see as their natural allies? Can one be a feminist without being a capital F feminist? What does it mean to be affiliated with these groups? And how do trans women and LGBTQ members understand their needs in light of the feminist movements? And lastly, how do feminist movements intersect with religious affiliations? So those are just 5 really, really big questions. I understand if it's a lot, but I wanted to kind of put it all on the table, and you can respond to any of those questions that you like. For Avia, I wanted to note the following things. When I did get your paper early this morning, and I saw that the term apparatus appears throughout, but it appears in many different kinds of contexts. Apparatus of modernity and nationalism, class apparatus, the world and apparatuses of power, social apparatus, the gun appears as an apparatus. When you have those kinds of terms that repeatedly turn up in different contexts, it's really hard to understand how exactly you're using that term. Finally, you notice you attribute it to Foucault. So it would be really helpful to get a kind of definition. If this term is going to be doing some really important work for you in your paper, that was something I had a little bit of trouble with. But to go to more substantial questions, I am really interested in this. The concept of mourning came up in your paper, both coming out of Judith Butler and also, as you showed, is something that brings together these two films. But I'm really interested in this connection between mourning and commemoration. How do you understand the relationship between mourning as this intensely private process of trauma and loss, and commemoration that is part of these films? So that connection. And I think that I can, now that I heard you presenting, one thing that kind of jumped out at me is that a lot of this film, you could maybe look at it from an angle of visibility and invisibility. So if you sort of go through your arguments, I would say that there are certain aspects that would show up in the kind of visibility categories. Commemoration is something that's very visible. The present is very visible. A film itself is a visible form, right? But in the category of invisible, you have graves, you have the past, you have mourning, you have even military service. So, and what I mean by invisibility and graves is that in South Korea itself, when you walk around, the things that are really most conspicuous in their invisibility are soldiers, you hardly see them, and cemeteries, right? You have to go to usually they're either in the countryside, if you have money to buy a plot of land, or you go to a kind of a public repository of ashes. So actually, death and graves are quite invisible compared to what we would see in Israel and the United States as well. There's a cemetery not far from where we live. So I am kind of interested in this if you can think about visibility and invisibility as a kind of organizing principle for your paper, I'd be really interested in hearing your thoughts. And I have to, of course, how can you not bring in a question about Korean pop culture? I'm curious about how, because I think your broader project is one that looks at the intersection of military and civilian life in South Korea. Maybe you're going to do a comparative project. Right, we just recently heard that the group BTS just received an extension on their ability to function as a group for a couple more years. So their military service has been delayed, and in general, I think the sort of the military civilian relationship or kind of everyday interactions is one that's very, very different from what maybe we're used to. So I'm kind of curious about where your kind of how this fits in more broadly with your dissertation project. And the last thing I would say is it's not really clear to me how this, as interesting as it is to hear these two films put together, I'm not quite sure how the comparison is working for you. In other words, by bringing these two films that do have a lot of overlaps, a lot of similarities, thematically, discursively, maybe even as well. What does it do for you to bring a black and white film from the 1950s by a Japanese author who is functioning in a completely different set of circumstances, and this 2004-2005 film in South Korea? So what does these two completely different sets of circumstances, what do they bring to the table when you put them together in the way that you've done? So I'll stop now. And I realize that I'm actually the person supposed to run this panel. So why don't we say, Anat, if you want to take a couple minutes to answer my questions, and then we can go over to Avia. And then I think we have about 28 minutes for discussion. So maybe try and limit your responses to 5 minutes each. You don't have to answer all my questions, and then we can open the floor. So Anat, you start.
Awesome. Let me just put my timer so I have that in front of me. Okay. So thank you, Daphna. Those are really great questions. I think some of them I addressed a little bit better in my paper, which was a draft, not a last draft in any way, shape, or form. It's part of, like I mentioned, what I think will be my 4th chapter. Could also be my 5th. I don't know exactly its placement, but in any way, so I want to quickly address all of your comments because they're all very relevant and very, very on the nose and perfect things I'm working through. So the first one was about the translations and appropriation of transnational or Western feminist scholarship. in ways that suit the local feminist community. So I want to specifically point to recent publications. So there have always been translations of key feminist texts, like Judith Butler was translated years and years ago. Kimberly Crenshaw was a little bit later. So there's always been a few translations online, but recently in the past, I want to say like 5 or 6 years, the push for alternative feminist publications and presses has been growing. So we have a few examples that I can think of, like Humanitas, I can't pronounce it. There's like that one. There is Book Nomad, which is a feminist alternative press. And so they create these like anthologies, or they have feminist scholars or public thinkers who write their own, like Kong Kim Hyun-young, like she will, have her own paper, but she will also translate like non-Korean scholarship into Korean and have that as part of her text. Or we have Sister Outsider that was translated, was it 2018, 2019? And that was a recent push for more Black feminist thought in the Korean feminist scholarship landscape, and for Korean feminism in general to be more intersectional. And even the term, so when I arrived in Korea, one of my main questions was about intersectionality, because it was kind of interesting, like what is intersectionality in a place that perceives itself to be homogenous, right? So Koreans still perceive themselves to be a very homogenous state. So then what does intersectionality mean in a place that perceives itself in that way? Clearly, Korea is not homogenous. I mean, we have immigrants, we have refugees, we have mixed race Koreans, etc. But in the feminist landscape, the discussion of intersectionality was still growing when I was there. So terms like intersectionality, terms like Black feminist thought, standpoint feminism, all of these were growing, but only within like the scholarship community, like the Korean feminist, formally educated in either feminist studies, gender studies, women's studies, those backgrounds. So it is also about accessibility to those materials. So there's quite a big push for translation. That was a long answer. Okay, I will try and make short answers for the rest of them. So exclusion of trans women is not unique. The specificity of the exclusion in Korea is more in the reasonings and in the way in which they're excluded. In other places, we see a more direct threat of violence. The trans women I spoke to, and I did speak to a few trans women, but they did not want to be interviewed out of fear of any sort of implications, even though I took all precautions. There is a great fear of violence for them in Korea. So I spoke to them sort of not a formal interview. They were more informal interviewees. And their fears were not, they were very visceral fears, but the feminist exclusion of trans women was not because they saw themselves as potentially violent or wanting to enact the violence against trans women. Like as you see in a lot of different TERF communities elsewhere, there's a direct threat of violence from TERF like activists or feminists towards trans women, but they themselves don't view what they're doing as violent. They view that exclusion as not moral or ethical, but necessary, like a necessary way to remove who they view as biologically not women. So it's a biological essentialism. It's reductive. It is binary, but it is a return to like a lot of previous arguments of, during like the war on sex that we had in the United States in like the 70s, those arguments within gender and sexuality studies. It brings us back to that kind of rhetoric and that scholarship. But for the South Korean sort of perspective, it's more about that safety, because they're still seen as not women, regardless of their own sort of positionality. So I know I'm over 5 minutes. I'm 30 seconds over that. I will just say one last thing. about the rejection of femininity and the rejection of non-traditional women, there is a complete blindsidedness to that. Like I want to mention that a lot of TERF women in Korea are lesbians. They are out and open lesbian women or self-identified queer women, and they reject non-traditional women because they are afraid of the potential of their bodies of being men. So that idea that there could be a biological male in their space is automatically an act of violence against them, or an act of a threat, a visceral threat against them. And so that's a little different in many ways, because those spaces are far and few in between. I know I didn't get to all your questions, but I am thinking through all of them, and they're terrific. So I want to make sure Via has enough time to talk. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so also thank you very much for the questions. So like Anat, my paper is also, it is far from the complete draft. I think you could tell by some of the roughness of the prose, but also there's several very large chunks of argument that did not make it into this version, which I presented, which focused on the morning. And I didn't even get to talk about Benedict Anderson and the building of the nation state and imagined communities and how all that ties in. So there is a lot still to talk about with these films. So I think, and that's also, I chopped all the explanation of the apparatus and Agamben, because in Complet, we're all kind of like, oh yeah, apparatus, and then and everybody just kind of rolls with it. So this was a mistake on my part. I apologize. But yes, I agree strongly that to use a word in this way needs to be carefully established at the beginning. And this is definitely something that will be more carefully treated in the final version of this paper. Now, so the question of mourning and commemoration, the way that I understand it, and I believe that the way that Judith Butler is arguing it, and also for the purpose of my paper, is that commemoration would be the formally, officially sanctioned form of mourning, which is legitimized by the state and as such is not a threat to it. So that would be the main thing, is that mourning itself, that because of the connection to the other, because of the transformation, it is fundamentally unable to be controlled by the state. And as such, it poses a threat. And for that, I think that it would definitely be interesting whether or not one could classify the graves in Seven Samurai as being a type of commemoration, meaning publicly sanctioned. But since Seven Samurai does not establish something that is similar to a nation state, I think that it would still qualify as a type of mourning. So I think that for this essay, I am personally leaning on the side of using the concept of mourning rather than commemoration for this discussion and its political implications. Now, I definitely think that thank you for the comments about visibility and invisibility. They are definitely something interesting that I'm going to look at and relate to the more complete through line of my work and see kind of what turns up. Regarding pop culture and BTS, my dissertation is actually staying far away from K-pop in part because for comparative literature, dealing with things like audience interaction, and that's just not really the type of analysis that we're doing. The fact that I write about film is already pushing it. The fact that I have one chapter with a webcomic is pushing it. So putting in, it's like the rest of my chapters are about very serious canonical books. So in that sense, I am going to be ignoring the existence of BTS wholly. But yes, I think that there is definitely a lot of really, really interesting stuff about the way that memory and commemoration and the presence of military life is in Korea and also in Israel. And part of my dissertation, though, involves the analysis of specifically how these are portrayed in fiction, how these bonds show up when people create them in fiction, what the fictional world of soldiers and civilians looks like. And I think that there are many cases where it does parallel certain things that are happening in the real world. But that's for my greater dissertation. Now, regarding the comparison between these two films, I believe, and watching them, I mean, I do believe that you could see Welcome to Dongmakol as being to some extent, a remake of Seven Samurai. I think that the connections are beyond just saying that there are some basic similarities. I think that between the specifically 7 warriors, the number of warriors that survive, the similarity of shots that take place. And so to me, if the movie is indeed interacting with Seven Samurai on that level, I think that it is the director and the creator who is inviting us to make that comparison and ask these questions. So in that sense, to me, that existence within the narrative is what justifies the analysis. Now, if my final paper is unable to convince the reviewers of the journal that it is significant enough to warrant treatment, then I guess I'm shit out of luck, as they say. But I do hope that, I think that by presenting Welcome to Dongmakol specifically in light of Seven Samurai, it highlights the focus on the soldiers and brings to light certain elements that we might otherwise take as granted as not having meaning. Like, for example, the location of the graves. I think that by seeing it juxtaposed with the similar work or a work that predecesses it, but that has such a difference, I think that it sheds a much stronger highlight on these issues of the turn to modernity and the conflict between the pre-modern and the modern, since the village of Dongmakol exists in both the pre-modern and the modern states. It is 5 minutes and 40 seconds.
Thank you both for doing such a great job of responding to a mess of questions in such a short time. So I will now open the floor to our participants to ask their questions. And I don't know what the best way to do this is. Can we see everybody in the gallery? Yes. So maybe just raise your hand and feel free to jump in. Yes, Alon.
Hi. Thank you for having an interesting talks, and thank Daphna for waking up in the Sunday morning. One question for Avia about Welcome to Dongmakol, a wonderful movie. And a question about the enemy. Who is the enemy? Who is the real enemy? Because it looks, if you look at the movie, you see that the enemy changes every few minutes. At the beginning, it's a South Korean, the North Korean, the Americans, the evil state. It's the villagers versus the soldiers. They don't know which soldier is the enemy, and it feels that the enemy changes along the road. And at the end of the story, in order to unify Korea, you have to die for it. While if you look at the Japanese film, there's a specific defined enemy, and it's constant the entire movie. So we have 2 movies with one was a specific enemy, and the other one is a different enemy that changes. And as one of the students, or I'm a student in Israel, said, "Who is the real enemy?" Because they all look the same. In the case of Welcome to Dongmakol, and sometimes you don't know who's the real enemy. It makes it very difficult to watch the movie.
So I think that is actually a very important question, I think. Specifically regarding the ending, I actually read that final scene as messianic time in the Benjaminian sense. And I think that there's a lot to say about that specific ending scene and how it connects to reunification. But I would definitely say that to some extent, the real enemy in Welcome to Dongmakol is violence itself, or the violence of the apparatus of modernity, or the apparatus of the state, because it is essentially showing the loss of innocence, the loss of childhood. I think that there is an element of post-colonialism. So you could argue that post-colonialism, that colonialism itself is the enemy. But I think that the enemy is more conceptual rather than a specific person, because I think that from the beginning, the movie makes it fairly clear that the North and South Koreans are not the true enemies of each other. It is them who are insisting, by holding on to these ideologies, that they are enemies. And now, I do personally think that I think that this is one of the major flaws of the film, that without really digging into it, the film is very saccharine, and I mean, its fundamental point is that if we all set ideology aside, we can all get along, which is a big, obvious, and very flat sort of statement. So I think that it's a film that invites a much deeper digging into the question of how states create enemies, which I don't think is straightforward.
Well, there are other Korean movies that, if you peel out the ideology, we are all Koreans, like
yes.
a good Walt Disney movie,
yeah.
But it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Politicians destroy this Walt Disney movie.
Yeah.
Guys, feel free to, Guy.
Okay, thank you very much for two very interesting talks. I actually had one question for Avia and one for Anat, but Daphna stole Daphna's last question was exactly the thing I wanted to ask Avia. So yes, I'm left with one question to Anat. Anat, how comfortable are you or how committed are you to this division between those terms of Korean feminism and Western feminism, and this whole idea of what exactly radical feminism means? Because my point is, I think that when we use the term Western feminism, we assume that there is such a thing as Western feminism, but at the same time, Western feminism is such a broad area of negotiations and discussions and arguments. And Judith Butler, that was mentioned here every second sentence, is a perfect example, because the impression that I got from your interesting presentation was that Korean feminism is very much attached to social activism, to nationalism, and one thing that Judith Butler was heavily criticized for by Martha Nussbaum in her famous article 20 years ago was that she was anything but connected to social activism, that she's indulged in her own theoretical and scholarship. And so I guess my point is, I mean, if you divide between Korean feminism and Western feminism, I think you might, I don't know, it could take you to wrong directions, because the real engagement should be with which parts of Western feminism do those Korean feminists interact with and relate to. And I mean, a stronger connections between specific thinkers within Western ideologies, rather than Western feminism as like one coherent field of research, of activism. And that's, again, radical feminism is very problematic. Radical is relativist, right? I mean, what does, and it seems that you yourself are trying to think about, you say radical and then radical. So where do you draw the line? How exactly do you differentiate between radical and not radical? And so I guess my question is, how do you swim in all this sea of feminist thought, which Western feminism itself is unclear about?
Thank you for those very interesting points, Guy. So these are issues that I am myself dealing with. So the last point you made about radicalism and radicalism being relative, and how do you define it, how do you draw the line, that is something that I kind of work through in a different chapter in my dissertation, where I talk about divisions amongst feminists themselves, the way that they draw the lines themselves within their own activism and activist spaces and organizational spaces. So I talk about 3 different emerging spaces. So you have the traditional state-approved feminist spaces, that is like women's relief and violence resource centers. Like one of the centers I worked with was the Korea Sexual Violence Relief Center, and they're legitimized by the state. So I talk about state legitimization. There I kind of interlace class divisions, accessibility to formal knowledge production, etc. And how that's a part of that division as well. Then I talk about the radical feminist movement in a very fragmented way, because as I pointed out, you have, and as you mentioned, there's radical and there's radical. But radical feminism is also first and foremost a rejection of traditionalist ways of doing activism. And that's not unique to Korea in any way. Like you see that here as well. Like in the United States, the Women's March, the Pussy Hats, all of those were in a way a radical intervention. Like, we don't want to do things the way they've been going. Let us take a different path. And that's not different in Korea. I'm not saying that Korean feminism is a brand new thing and it is not related to other movements. I actually make the case in my larger dissertation that it's more connected to a pan-Asian feminist solidarity movement more than a transnational global feminist movement. There is more of a connection to Indian, Southeast Asian, Japanese and even Chinese, to an extent, feminism than there is to Western American feminism. There's more of a push for conversations with Dutch feminists than there is towards like American or like UK centric like feminist conversations. So I'm not saying that Korean feminism is a brand new thing. There are definitely, as you mentioned, these legacies that are connected to it. And Korean feminism is definitely a movement that is socially forward. It is focused on social activism. It's focused on political activism. In the last couple of years, there have been two feminists who have been trying to kind of enter the scene as politicians, not for the sake of actually winning seats in parliament, although one did, or two, but more for the sake of being on the scene, of being seen as outspoken feminist thinkers and politicians, and to draft legislation and attempt to pass that through. So it's not that I'm trying to, this is not a comparative analysis between Korean feminism and Western feminism, but rather I am pointing to the fact that Korean feminism definitely takes ideas that fit it and kind of runs with it. We see that with the Me Too movement. Like, Me Too in Korea is not an extension of the American Me Too movement. It's not, I think to say that would be very reductive. Even the Korean feminist scholar Kwon Kim Hyun-young, she pointed out that if we do that, that is very much a colonial legacy. If we attach Me Too in Korea to an American Me Too, that is kind of continuing those legacies, because the Korean version of Me Too has its own specificities in Korea, and therefore it looks and sounds very different. For instance, in Korea, Me Too movement had the adjacent hashtag with you, which doesn't really exist anywhere else, because a lot of women in Korea still didn't feel comfortable, even online, coming out with their stories of sexual harassment or sexual violence, and instead used with you as a way to kind of denote, I'm with you, I'm an ally, I'm a supporter. And maybe this happened to me, but I can't say this yet. So there are ways in which Korean feminism takes a lot from Western feminism. And I don't mean to say Western feminism is a monolith. I probably should have made that a little more clear. When I say Western feminism, I am just talking about the, I guess the academy's focus on prioritizing Western-based scholarship. So, you know, quoting Judith Butler is great. Judith Butler has a lot of great ideas that, you know, we can run with, but there's also a lot of great critique. And the reason is because you can't copy paste Judith Butler into the Korean context. You can't. That's why when works are translated into in Korea, there's always the afterword, and the afterword gives context, not just to the ideas that Judith Butler is bringing forward, but to the criticisms, and to the criticisms are specific to the Korean context. And so, you know, it's a very difficult space to navigate. But for me, I am definitely a very gender and sexuality studies focused scholar. And so a lot of times when I am talking about Korean feminism, there is always this attachment of, how do you justify Korean feminism as opposed to Western-based feminism or American Anglo-Saxon feminism? Like, there needs to be a qualification of that in what you're doing. So I guess my work is a response to that in some ways. So I take a very strong feminist citational practice, as Sarah Ahmed kind of talks about, where I heavily cite Korean feminist scholarship and Korean scholarship in general. One of my chapters is just based on a political science theorist in Korea. And so that's kind of my response to that. I hope that clarifies it a little bit. But yeah, what you're saying is great and totally things I'm working through right now. So thank you.
We have to wrap it down. I'll say a few words. First of all, thanks to Daphna, Avia and Anat. Avia, Israeli time, Anat and Daphna, Pacific time. A wonderful weather in the state of California. I want to say a few things. I will send you the schedule and with the links to the Zoom, because we will have an opening session, and then at 10 o'clock we will have 2 panels. Later on, you will have your own lunch. This time, thanks to the Zoom, thanks to the coronavirus, no free lunch, no free dinner, and then bye. Yeah. You can drink your own soju and makgeolli or whatever, and have your ramyun. Then the MA PhD students are invited for a talk with Professor An, plus some of the scholars who wants to join. After that, we were supposed to have 2 sessions, but we will have only 1 session because this is the second panel, and we will have a final panel that Liora Tzarfati will talk about her new book. Guy Potter will be the boss. So follow the instructions, follow the Zoom. And again, thanks to the Korean Embassy for its journalist support. You haven't asked any questions. You're allowed to ask as many questions as you want. So thank you very much. Good morning to the people in the States. Good evening to the people in Israel. And see you next Sunday. Toda. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.